Hello and welcome. As I sat here wondering how to begin this video, of course I want to go back to the origin and talk about all the stages and steps that it takes to get to adolescence. And since we're in a psychology class, of course we need to start thinking about the actual brain itself, right? If we were in biology, we'd be focusing more on the anatomy and the body's development, and then for some odd reason we separate the brain out and call that psychology, even though the structure of the brain itself is biology, right? It's really just cells and chemicals, and somehow cells and chemicals turn into adolescent brains. And so again, how does this process start? And so let's say a baby's out of the womb, right? Why do babies sleep so much? It's because the brain is encoding all of that stimuli. It's building up schemas of knowledge. And I love teaching memory because all memory, all knowledge is just memories, okay? So that's kind of weird to think about. But all knowledge is just stored information. But how does the brain store information? Somehow it's stored with neurons releasing neurotransmitters. And this process of neurons releasing transmitters, not only with memory, but also just cognitive functioning in general, thinking, both the unconscious and the conscious mind, is really just neurons releasing neurotransmitters. And somehow that enables us to do amazing things like art and being able to write and read and talk and work together and build and have this amazing power of reflection, all of which requires a conscious mind, which evolved over many millennia through evolution. Again, like in an intro class, right, you're going to study like the three phases of the brain, that one that controls the heartbeat and, the basic functioning. Then all of a sudden the limbic system comes along somewhere in our evolution, which starts getting into all the emotional functioning. And then longer after that, we develop the prefrontal or the cortex of our brain, right? The outer brain, which is the part of our brain that does all of that complex functioning. It's what separates us from a dog, for example. Us humans, we have the power to reflect, to put ourselves in other people's shoes. And why did we evolve this theory of mind where we can, take ourselves outside of ourselves and look at the world? And again, that probably has an evolutionary adaptation in that we can think before we act. We can, ponder and question and approach things from diverse, ways instead of just being purely instinct and reactive. And so you can see why our brain has become what it is today. You've evolved in this way that I can, somehow talk on a computer that some human built and then have a conversation and teach psychology. I mean, that's just absolutely incredible. But again, that requires that outer part of our brain. And once you hit adolescence, this is when that outer part of our brain, I guess, really starts to kick in, because it's in adolescence that you develop that ability to reflect, to put yourself in other people's shoes, to see yourself through the eyes of other people. And this, you can't, younger children, like before, 10, 11, 12, they really struggle with this. And then so adolescents, once they all of a sudden they'll realize that, hey, the world could see me, and they start seeing themselves through the other people's shoes. Your book makes some comments about how, that's when adolescents think, that they're super special and that only them have experienced these feelings and stuff. And there's a good section in your book about that. There's a little bit of a joke in there, but something to think about. Hopefully you guys read the book. All right, but let's delve into adolescence. Again, we've been through all of our phases now, from coming out of the womb to storing a bunch of memories to learning how our body works. And then, here we come as toddlers and we start exploring the world and we start wandering off from our parents. And then, we kind of get into early childhood where we're, going to school and we're starting to get more into our peers. We're becoming more socialized. Our brain is growing. We're able to do more complex things. We start to do 1 plus 1, 2 plus 2. Then you get in middle childhood, 7 to 11, where they're really starting to form their identity. Their personality is really starting to show. They're still in that growth mindset, but you can see where their personality is starting to get fixed. They're highly socialized from the social context. They have a full use of language. By about 5, really, a kid can speak as well as any adult. Whether or not they're going to talk baby talk for the fun of it is a whole nother story. But, still they have that capability. They have the memories of the stored words in their brain by that age. And then here we come into adolescence where they really start to apply all that knowledge. They are, spending so much of their time in school, away from their parents, interacting with their peers, going out on their own, expressing their autonomy, figuring out who they are as people, which again is not done as an adolescent, but there's a big time where you start to ask that question of who am I? So, really good chapter in general. All right, so the book opens up talking about intelligence, education, and motivational development. And again, why? Because you can see where early childhood, middle childhood, adolescence, this is a very important time for the actual brain growth to be occurring. And so that's why you look at things like how is poverty associated with brain growth. Again, kids need that challenge. They need food, support, love, all of these things to really be able to maximize their potential. And without that Vygotskian challenge and that social investment, that socialization, will they develop the cultural capital, to be able to go out in the world? And will they develop that self-efficacy and, competency and belief in who they are as a person to give them that strength, to go out and be resilient in the face of what the world has to offer, especially when we have to leave the nest, for example. So the idea is, children in middle and late adulthood have a more realistic sense of self than those in early childhood, and they better understand their strengths and weaknesses. And so at this time, children are starting to look around and they're starting to become more aware of their own performance compared to other people. Again, you can see it at about age 7, right? That where kids start to be aware of authority and how other people think about themselves, and they start to look at themselves through the eyes of others. And by adolescence, this is highly attuned, okay? Adolescents are able to include other people's appraisals of them into their self-concept, including the agents of socialization, like parents, teachers, peers, culture, and the media. Internalizing others' appraisals and creating social comparison affect children's self-esteem. Again, so this is a good stage where we're going to be applying the looking glass self, or in psychology, the theory of mind, the ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, like I've been talking about this whole time. That is not only associated with our sense of awareness, but also with our sense of growing as a person that we're going to become. We need to be aware of the social expectations to become that person. It is at this time where adolescents start to develop this concept of self-esteem, but in order to have self-esteem, you have to be aware of a comparison of other people. And so our self-esteem is highly based upon how we think other people feel about us, along with how we evaluate our own identity, for example. And so adolescents are seeking to develop this sense of self-understanding, this self-concepts, this belief about their general personal identity. But who we are as a person, ourself, is highly associated with our experiences in the social context and, how we think other people view us. Okay, and so the book says that large discrepancies between self-efficacy, defined as the belief that you are capable of doing tasks and achieving goals, a discrepancy between self-efficacy and ability can create motivational problems for individuals. And so it's important at this time that idea of, I see the idea back in the day, we had the No Child Left Behind, but again, this is really important because again, as children go into those stages where they realize their skills and their abilities and they start to compare themselves to other people, is there going to be a discrepancy with their belief in themselves and what they're actually achieving out in the social world when they go to compare themselves to others? So again, you get into this self-handicapping kind of thing, like if you don't believe you can do it. So how is it that an adolescent, for example, can believe it in themselves that they can do it? What does it take for someone to have that sense of self-worth, self-competency? Does it require to have this finite self-concept of who you are as a person? Not necessarily. Again, we're all evolving our self-concept over time, but we also need that, inherent belief that I can do it. The choo-choo train. I think I can. I think I can. That idea is so important to kids because that builds up our self-esteem, which then plays into our motivation. Again, if we don't believe we can do it, are we going to be motivated to do it? But if we do believe we can do it, we'll be motivated to do it. And so, again, our ability to grow our brain, our ability for our intelligence, our motivation is so associated with our sense of self concept and who we are as a person. And so, also what we're interested in, things like that, what that will motivate us too based upon our personality. But again, our belief in ourselves, self-efficacy is very important at this stage in time. So your book gets into the theories of intelligence, in this part of it, because it is really asking the question, what does it take to develop a fully developed human being? What kind of social investment do we need? What kind of psychological individual motivation is required? And then from a sociological standpoint, what about the social context? How does the social context play a role in developing or structuring or socializing adolescents to live up to their fullest potential, have that strong sense of self-esteem and believe in who they are and what they're doing? What does that take beyond the basics like food, shelter, and water? Again, we need hugs, we need support, we need challenge, okay? So this just is a little bit of a side note to delve into the ideas of intelligence, which you'll get in many other classes like cognitive psychology or your intro class. But the book asks, how many different types of intelligence are there? What is the role of nature versus nurture in intelligence? How is intelligence represented in the brain? And the meaning of group differences in intelligence. And so again, what are the different types of intelligence? We'll talk about in a second. There's a couple of, scholastic ideas on this subject. But again, the role of nature versus nurture, again, your ability or capacity to become the most intelligent person you are is highly influenced by your genetics. Same thing with your personality. I think it would be a common understanding that about half of who you are is your personality and your genetics. But the other half is the psychological cognitions and emotions and personality, and then every experience you had in the social context, all the people you've interacted with, and then all the other variables in the social context that can be associated with things like brain growth, such as poverty, you know? And so when you look at things like group differences in intelligence, people that are poor versus people that are middle class or more wealthy, you tend to see significant differences. Why? Well, one reason is basic nutrition. What's the most important thing for brain growth is, did that kid eat today? Okay, so again, we have to take in the idea that there is inequality when it comes to intelligence, just like there's inequality in the quality of schools, and the quality of school you go to is then associated with intelligence. So again, we always need to be considering the interplay between the biological factors, the individual factors, those psychological factors like cognition, emotion, motivation, and then the sociological factors like the social context, parenting styles, things along those lines. So your book breaks it down into general intelligence, which should be a measure of all intelligence, and then specific intelligence, measuring individual intelligence like ability to do art, music, math, reading, writing, whatever it might be. The general intelligence factor, the G, is defined as a construct that the different abilities and skills measured on the intelligence tests have in common. And so it's looking at just the general intelligence across all those measures. And then specific, again, is looking at the specific intelligence. And I mean, general, if done right, should be a measure of all potential specific intelligences. But again, you can see the challenge in that. How do we measure a test that can encapsulate that many variables into one thing? That's a big critique of intelligence tests in the end. Um, at this stage, adolescents develop this ability to engage in abstract thinking that includes the ability to acquire knowledge, reason abstractly, and to adapt to novel situations and benefit from instruction and experience at a really high rate. But again, that ability to think outside the box, to get outside your head, really doesn't develop until adolescence. This is generally a time where they start to measure these kinds of things. People with higher intelligence have been shown to learn faster. And again, specific intelligence, or the S, is a measure of how specific skills can be measured in narrow domains. So the theories of intelligence, your book talks about the triarchic or three-part theory of intelligence, where people may display more or less analytical intelligence, creative intelligence, and practical intelligence. And so again, this is one way to measure the G, just looking at analytical abilities, your creative abilities, and practical abilities, which is kind of like street smarts, art, and things along those lines, and then your ability to solve problems. Traditional intelligence tend to assess analytical intelligence, not so much things like art or street smarts. And so again, who benefits from, the analytical test? Those people that go to the formalized education that understand what the tests are asking and know how to use the symbols to make sense of it and do a good job on it. It's at this time where adolescents develop convergent thinking, or it's during early and middle childhood that they learn the convergent thinking, but it's adolescence where they really learn divergent thinking. So convergent thinking, I like to think about it like when you ask like a young child to count money, they always start from the smallest and work their way up. Whereas an adolescents can break it down and start with like a 20 or a 50 and work their way down, which younger children tend to struggle with. So again, convergent thinking is directed toward finding the correct answer to a problem from the bottom up, and then divergent from the top down is one way it's always often discussed. And then practical intelligence is discussed as intelligence that can't be gained from books or formal learning. Practical intelligence represents a type of street smarts or common sense. So again, if you kind of look at the triarchic theory, you're looking at like the school smarts, the analytical stuff, your art, creative abilities, even sports and things like that, I think would go into that level. And then practical intelligence, your ability to get around in the world and just general common sense that's acquired. So theory of multiple intelligences, the idea of specific types of intelligence rather than one overall intelligence. Again, I don't think the triarchic theory of these three is really sufficient. How many different ways can we break out levels of intelligence? How many different types of creative intelligence? Again, is it sports? Is it music? Is it art? I mean, just thinking abstractly is creative intelligence, which generally falls into analytical intelligence. So again, it's all kind of skewed, but for many years, people have been trying to figure out how to measure it, and we've proposed many different ways of doing it. But again, it's a good critique of intelligence tests to recognize that there's multiple forms of intelligence. Your book talks about autistic savants. Autistic savants may really struggle with social skills, but they can like see an image and then completely reproduce it exactly to detailed like measure of by inch or centimeter to scale. Okay, I guess they can draw it to scale. And it's pretty fascinating. I studied autistic savants for a long time. I'm really interested in autism. And again, autism results from there's barriers between parts of your brain that are responsible for things like colors and music. And if those barriers, if there's an error, the neurons tend to cross those barriers where they shouldn't be going. So autistics will like play music in color, like play red, play blue. Autistics can do math by blending colors. And so again, the brain can do incredible things, but we're all sort of limited by our attention. And with autism, is an attention disorder. Hence, what happens if the attention capacities are broken or the attention highways are broken? There can be some consequences, even though there can be some awesome things that come out of it too that are just other people can't do that don't have autism, for example. But things like studies of effects of brain damage, stroke, autistic savants give us comparisons of the way that the brain is structured in different areas and how that functions. Um, Measuring intelligence, we always have to ask questions like reliability versus validity. So reliability, we're asking things like consistency, and validity, we're asking is the data actually accurate? So an intelligence test is reliable if someone takes it over and over and over again, and several people take it and they keep getting the same answers. But is it actually measuring what it's supposed to be measuring? And that's where we have to find the validity. But again, most of our standardized tests that we take in modern times, of course, they have great statistical reliability and validity attached to it. Many tests are done to make sure of that. But again, what are they actually testing? Are they only testing the stuff you learn in school? And what about the kids that aren't interested in school? They're interested in things outside of the school, like going out in the Alaskan wilderness and knowing what every type of feather is. Okay, is it an eagle feather? Is it a young eagle feather? What kind of eagle is it from? I mean, I don't have that kind of knowledge, but someone who lives in Alaska and goes out in the woods would. The Flynn effect talks about um, the fact is people have been getting smarter with each generation, and again, that could be because as the social context grows and becomes more technologically advanced, our dissemination of knowledge increases, and then we socialize our children with that advanced dissemination of knowledge, and so their knowledge is growing. But we generally have to make the test a little bit harder with each time. The book does give you a calculation of IQ, and it even says that this isn't really a measure that's used commonly as much today, But IQ is your mental age divided by your chronological age times 100. Mental age is the age at which a person is performing intellectually. So if you took all 12-year-olds and asked them to take a test, what would the average, person's score be versus their chronological age? I mean, there could be some, 10-year-olds that do better than some 12-year-olds on a test, for example. And so that's how you measure that person has a higher IQ based upon that. And a little bit, that's not used as much. Most modern intelligence tests are based on the relative position of a person's score among people of the same age. Rather than on that formula. So now we kind of use the quartiles or the percentiles, like your child is in the 38th or 64th or 99th percentile of people that age group when it comes to scores on this test instead of the IQ score, which of course the online internet tests are still, I'm sure, obsessed with. Um, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale is used for adults, not for children. It consists of 15 tasks, each designed to assess intelligence, including working memory, arithmetic ability, spatial ability, and general knowledge about the world. Again, but is that studying your ability to go out in the woods and survive? Again, so again, the bias of intelligence tests, they tend to favor an Anglo-American way of thinking, middle class way of life, and again, does that measure non-academic types of intelligence or talent? You know what I mean? Your book also talks about cultural variations, like our tests measure speed of thinking, but there's many cultures that encourage you to not just automatically talk, think about what you're going to say, through all the answers before you make a decision on the thing you're going to say. And if people think like that, are they going to score as well on an Americanized or British intelligence test that's measuring how fast you can do it, you know what I mean, to decide if you're smart or not? And so again, we have to look at all the critiques when it comes to measuring intelligence. And I like the bigger critiques, like, who's really the smarter species, an ant or or a human, who's going to live through a nuclear holocaust. So as a species, what really creates, the better species? Is it, having this awesome outer cortex in our brain, or is it our ability to survive a nuclear holocaust? I mean, just things to throw out there. Um, so again, education is a huge factor when it comes to intelligence for kids. And again, as I'm saying, the social context, your parents' socioeconomic status, your education level, your educational attainment, the schools that you go to play huge roles in how well you advance, especially during these school age years, like young childhood and adolescence going into, high school and into college. So again, the social context plays a big role in your overall development. Think about your cultural exposure and all your experiences. How is that evolving you into who you are? Are you getting the good lectures? Are you getting the good stimuli? Are people investing in you? Are they taking care of you properly? We have to be asking all of these questions. So again, I always take a biopsychosocial approach to intelligence. We're looking at, your genetics and how does that play a role in how smart you can be. And then what about your own individual stuff? Like, are you motivated? Are you feeling it? Are you pumped up to give this lecture? Are you pumped up to go to college and rock it out? And then the social context. What's out here in the world that's influencing you? Do you have good role models? Are you given support? Are you going to good schools? Do you have access to food? All of these things. Um, the book introduces gender a little bit here, and that the stereotypes held by your parents and teachers can influence a children's self-efficacy in various domains. I don't want to get too much into stigma in this. I'll talk about it a little bit in the kind of concluding lecture of Adolescence. This will be part one of part two. I'll talk a little bit more about stigma and things in that one. But again, your book has talked about how once your parents find out what gender you are, they start socializing you into the cultural way of life of that gender, which is then associated with your likes, your dislikes, even your career decisions across the lifespan. Okay. And so, again, historically, and globally, even in modern times, women are not invested as much as men. Women, are subjugated in the lower classes. They're not given the educational access. There's not females in every classroom in every country. You know what I mean? There hasn't been a women's rights movement to even enable that kind of power for women to increase their life chances and get out of the lower classes. And so that's always been a big factor. Also, things like parental involvement in your school. Parents vary in their level of involvement with their children's schools, but research suggests that if you want to give them that edge, you have to work with them outside of the school, get them prepared before they go to kindergarten. Does having them already know how to read before they hit kindergarten help out? And family capital, your parents' socioeconomic status, this is the number one thing associated with things like intelligence and whether or not you're going to college. It just is, because people with have good socioeconomic status have food and nutrition and access to health care and all the things that you need. They go to good schools, they get challenged, they have the money to go to good colleges, or whatever, at least get through college, whatever it might be, okay? And so, again, access is not fair across the board, and that is associated with development. You know what I mean? I mean, if you don't eat when you're a kid, are you going to be malnourished? And so, again, the families that have a lot of socioeconomic status, are their kids going to have a more better outcomes developmentally than those who don't? And the answer tends to be yes. There are cultural differences also with things like bilingualism. And there's a lot of things that suggest that, yes, bilingualism increases neural pathways and does all kinds of magical things for the brain. However, when it comes to things like testing, because you have two different languages in your head, you know, mono language speakers tend to do better on an SAT, for example, than a bilingual speaker just because of the language capacities, albeit a bilingualist has more uh, words and ability to speak more. Do they have as good of mastery of a language as a mono speaker? And so your book basically says that mastery of speaker is one of the cognitive disadvantages, or as if when you go to speak bilingually or more. Okay. So mindset is really important for adolescents, as with all age groups. But again, your book defined mindset as organized sets of beliefs people have about the nature or ability of what make themselves or capable of learning. And so mindset's really important. Again, your book says that students or children, adolescents with the growth mindset are more open to new experiences, that growth mindset translates to better outcomes in the end. And again, it's debatable. What is a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset? Just because somebody has a fixed mindset and they don't necessarily budge doesn't mean that they're not open to taking in information. But it just might be the way that they approach things. That it doesn't mean they always have to go have all these new experiences just, to get information in their head. You can get information just by reading books over and over and over again and doing the same thing and hanging out with the same friends. So it's kind of debatable, but again, there is some evidence that says having that open-mindedness is good because it opens the door to having new experiences, but then creates, brain growth, etc. Your book also talks about learned helplessness, which we discussed. Again, things like stigma, lacking the self-efficacy, not having the beliefs, the effects of stereotypes can increase our learned helplessness and lack of belief in our ability to do things. It's good for us to have our learning goals and set those goals to achieve those goals, and to also have our performance goals. Okay, I'm going to do puberty and the rest of this in lecture 2 for you so that you guys can all take a break. So I'm going to stop this here for the end of part 1 and to be continued on adolescence, because this chapter just goes on for days. If you look at your book, it's probably the most extensive one because there's just so much happening and just so many different things on the book. So, all right, here we go.